Hey, how's it going? And welcome to the 2023 Spend Less, Profit More Masterclass. In this Masterclass series, we're going to be going through all the different platforms that are really relevant right now for most brands, Meta, TikTok, Google, all that kind of stuff. And then we're going to get really into the metrics and go over some things that no one has ever really talked about, and also bring back some old ideas that are more relevant than ever. So let's go ahead and hop into this. I would just say that this is definitely more for brands who have already spent a little bit on ads or who have spent a lot in the past and maybe just haven't gone back into it after iOS 14, the pandemic and everything like that. So this will get you up to date. And this is really some of the most insightful stuff that we're seeing working right now for brands in 2023. So let's go ahead and hop into it. Let's just keep in mind this equation. This, of course, is pretty much everything that is included for you to add more profit into your pocket at the end of each month. So really what this looks like is your visitors times the average order value of your site times the conversion rate, minus variable costs, and of course minus fixed costs at the end of the day. That's going to be your profit, right? That's literally every variable that's included when it comes to actually profiting and growing the brand, which is what we're focused on. In reality, though, average order value, right? This can be broken down into a lot of different things. New customer average order value is very different from returning customer average order value, right? So what we think about more and what's a more accurate representation of your brand is actually visitors times LTV times conversion rate minus variable costs equals profit. And of course, variable costs, we're including COGS, fulfillment operations on a variable basis, that kind of thing, but we're just not including those fixed costs like Shopify subscription and that kind of thing, okay? Now, the LTV, right? LTV, lifetime value, is a hard thing to measure, right? Because your brand probably hasn't been around for 100 plus years. So what we have to do is we actually have to pick a period, which is why it's PLTV. We have to pick a period in which we measure LTV by. So this depends on the brand, and this depends on the sales cycle and how often your customers buy. And it also depends on how much cash you have in your inventory turnover, right? Typically, it's going to be a 60-day LTV that we look at. But for some brands in the more luxury space, it can be a 90 or even 180-day LTV that makes more sense based off their inventory, cash flow, and really just how often customers buy on average. Right? If your product runs out every 90 days, you need to do a 90-day LTV. So it's on a case-by-case basis, but the variables to determine what LTV you should be looking at, again, is going to be your cash flow, how long it takes to get more inventory, of course, just when your customers buy on average, when you see those spikes after their first purchase. Those are the kind of things you're going to want to look at. We'll get more into this later, but in general, this is the equation. And of course, this entire training is going to be on the advertising acquisition side of this. So of course, to grow your brand, what could we do here, right? To grow your brand, we could increase the amount of visitors to your store. That would grow it. We could increase the average order value or lifetime value. That would grow your brand. We could increase the conversion rate, right? That would grow. Or we could decrease your variable costs or fixed costs, and that would also give you more net profit at the end of the day. So these are all levers we can pull on. This is old knowledge, right? But again, this is just more important than ever, especially to understand the lifetime value piece of this, because it's harder and harder to profit off of first orders. And really what we're seeing, and we'll get into this a little bit later, is that the brands that sacrifice first order profitability often can get more market share more quickly and therefore scoop all the customers up before you can get to them, simply because they're willing to wait till they cash out on that lifetime value. But again, we'll get more into that later, but it's just something to note for now, okay? Cool. So let's get into the next section here, which is what gets into ad growth and really what those numbers look like. So again, in general, we need to understand COGS. We need to understand all these things. So if you have not done something like this on a per unit basis and you don't know what kind of ROAS you should be getting or return on ad spend you should be getting on a per unit basis and on a blended basis, you need to fill something like this out. The link will be included below. This just is all your costs, and it gives you an option to put in the margin that you want to make on each sale, and that will give you a target cost per customer acquisition. And of course, you can look at when you spend X amount, how much you should be getting in a net profit. So this is good to start to understand some of those COGS and costs and understand this is the CPA you should be looking at. And oftentimes, if you have a unrealistic ROAS, a 20, a 50, a whatever that return on ad spend is, if it's too high, it's going to tell you that you need to figure something out on your costs and lowering those costs. Otherwise, you'll never be profitable when it comes to the ad side. Okay. So Again, this is some old knowledge, but I just want to reiterate this is very important to have. The next thing to understand, okay, so let's go through the key ad metrics and things that will make you more profitable or less profitable. And this doesn't matter if it's on TikTok or Google or Meta, this calculator really applies to everything, okay? So again, we have all our website. These are all website variables, AOV and conversion rate. Visitors is going to be a ad channel variable, right? We can determine that with the ad channel, but we can't really determine average order value or conversion rate as much with an ad channel other than the products that we're selling. If we're selling, more expensive or cheaper products, and to the audience in which we're selling to, right? We're selling to a warm audience or a very cold audience who hasn't heard of us, right? So these are just things to keep in mind. So let's just run through this calculator real quick just to show you the few key variables that are important just to be aware of, okay? To be aware of when it comes to the ad side. And again, this is old knowledge, but we need to run through this very quickly, okay? So the first is ad spend, right? We're just going to put $10,000 as an example. This is your unique outbound click-through rate, or on some platforms, just your click-through rate. And this is simply the percent of people that click on the ad to go to this website, not just click on the ad to look at the picture or read the description. It's the percent of people that click on the ad to go to the website. Here, we'll just put 3% as an example. The next metric is your CPM, cost per mil, so the cost to show the ad to 1,000 people. In this particular case, this is actually the cost per mil on the reach side. So the cost to reach 1,000 people, there's a slight discretion there. Some platforms do not have CPMR, they just have CPM. So again, don't worry about that. We're just gonna be talking about CPM here. So in this case, it would cost $0.015 to show the ad to one individual person, right? Okay, then we look at conversion rate, which is your website conversion rate, which again is determined mostly by the website, but also the traffic source, the products to offer, all these things play into this. And then of course your average order value. And again, this will depend on the products you're showing, new or old customers, the offer, etc. It's impacted by quite a few things. So in general, we just need to understand, and you need to fill this out and look at, based on your metrics that you're seeing in your account right now, what is your general return across all your products? And you can also do this on a per product basis. But just to show you how big of an effect, of course, conversion and AOV have on your actual end of day profitability, again, we'll just quickly throw in some variables. So as we can see here, we'd have an ad profit of around 44, again, before any costs, and we have a return of about a 5.4x ROAS. But if our conversion rate, instead of a 1.8 on the site, was maybe a 0.5, right? We see this a lot, you would only have a 1.5 ROAS. And if we just made this 0.5 conversion rate to a 1%, we just doubled the entire ROAS. So when you're looking at which levers to pull in the business, this is a good way to see which things are having a huge impact on your profitability versus what's really not having a huge impact. Okay, so let's go back to that 0.5, and the same thing is true for AOV. So if we had a lower AOV, we go from 1.5 ROAS, as we can see here, down to a 0.75, so not very profitable, right? So again, AOV also has a big impact. And if we just took this 75 AOV and increased it by, say, $20, so 70, 80, 90, 95. Oh, but now we're at a 0.95 ROAS, so we're almost break even, right? And if we just increase it a little bit more, maybe 120, right? Now we're a little bit better, we're at 1.2. So these are just all variables you have to keep in mind, again, when you're looking at ads here in 2023. Again, this is old news, but these are all very important things. And the same thing is true for click-through rate, right? If no one's clicking on our ads, 0.5%, our ROAS goes way down. If we get a ton of people to click on our ads, something viral, 5%, okay, now we're at a 2x return, right? Maybe our CPM, and of course CPM is mostly determined by the platform and the audience that you target, right? So the more selective and targeted of an audience you're going after, the more expensive, and the broader, typically the cheaper, right? And especially if it's an undesirable audience or a desirable audience, so people that buy Apple versus Androids, so those audiences are going to have a different price on them, okay? So same thing here, if you have a super expensive audience, right, ROAS doesn't make sense. And if you have a super cheap audience, ROAS makes more sense. Okay, so these are just all variables that play into it. And in reality, there's really only like 4 variables, so you only have to keep your eyes really on these few. There's a few more minute ones, but these are the big variables to just be aware of in general, right? But a lot of people will say, oh, I have a low click-through, or, oh, I have a high CPM. But in reality, what we see is you might have a really high CPM. You could have a crazy CPM at $60, right? A really expensive audience. But typically, if it's an expensive audience, it means they're very qualified and they're going to convert on the website at a higher percent. So this audience might convert at like a 4% because they're super qualified. They could even just be a retargeting audience. But maybe you're targeting a cheaper audience who doesn't convert that much because it's just not as high of quality. It's not your true demographic. It's only 10 CPM, but in reality, their conversion rate would probably be a lot lower. It might be like a 0.25. So the more expensive audience could make sense. And the same is true for all these variables, right? So you could have a higher click-through, a lower click-through, a higher CPM, a lower CPM, right? All these variables play in with each other. So it's just finding a good mix of all of them that makes sense for you, okay? And then the last piece of this calculator here, of course, is just your 1-year customer return rate. And again, you can do this for any period, 1 year, 90 days. Again, that should be determined in the beginning and what we went over before, and looking at cash conversion cycle, when customers naturally just buy your products again, that kind of thing. In this example, it's just 1 year. So this is just the percent of customers that buy again in 1 year. And we just multiply this times our average order value. Of course, second order average order value might be different than first order. But in general, this can just give us a better idea if customers come back in a year, what our true new customer ROAS is. So instead of a 1.5, it might be more like a 1.72 over the course of a year, simply because people came back who we originally acquired through ads, okay? So all things just to keep in mind, play around with this, put your numbers in and see what comes out, and kind of see what some of your bottlenecks and what some of your opportunity levers are with this tool, okay? So just keep this in mind. Again, this is old news, so let's move on from this and let's get into the next thing. Cool? All right, so those are really the key things that go into growth. It's literally this growth equation, this calculator, and understanding your costs. And we'll get into some more metrics soon that really determine your growth, but this is just kind of the foundation and like what's actually going on behind the scenes. So every single profitable and extremely fast growing brand out there understands these metrics, and every month they're looking on this at a per product basis and saying, okay, what is our new customer ROAS? What is our contribution margin? What is our net profit on each product? And how can we increase all of these metrics and decrease our costs as much as possible? So understanding this is the foundation to profitability. Cool? All right, so we're going to get now into why ROAS is trash. So we just mentioned ROAS, of course, so it's a bit contradictory, but in general, ROAS is not the key metric we want to be looking at. It's good to just keep in mind in general for your ads, but we're actually going to disprove why you shouldn't actually be looking at ROAS too much, other than just for kind of a quick reference of how things are going in general, okay? So here's an example, and this kind of thing happens all the time. Say we're running an ad A, and it's a sampler pack. Again, I know this doesn't apply to all those niches out there, but bear with me, this will make sense. You have a sampler pack, it's at a 2x ROAS, right? So for every dollar you spend, you make 2 back. Let's just say you spent $10 on the ad, you generated 20, right? Not bad. So we doubled our money, right? And let's say this person actually buys again in 20 days for the same amount, $20, because they bought the sampler pack, right? They got to try everything. They're confident in their buying decision. So pretty soon after they finished the sampler pack, they found something else they liked and they buy it for $20. So this is a 2x ROAS on the first order, but on the second order in 60 days, it's actually a 3x. Now, if we look at ad B, we had a 3x ROAS on our first order. We spent 10, generated 30, but let's just say they bought the whole pack, right? They just bought the whole pack. Maybe they didn't like it. Maybe it wasn't the right thing, and they just didn't buy again. They didn't really want to try anything else, any other varieties or flavors or whatever in this example. So their 60-day ROAS is also a 3x. Now, what often happens is you see in your ads manager on Google or whatever it is, TikTok, that you have a 2x on this ad and you cut it and you keep the 3x going. But in reality, they're both the same over a 60-day period, right? So this is what we have to understand, is that ROAS is not really doesn't represent the value of customers over time. And that is a huge issue, especially for brands with reoccurring products, reoccurring purchases, just in general, people that come back more often to buy, okay? So this is the singular reason and the most important reason as why we can't really look at ROAS, because if you turn this ad off, it would have been a complete waste. You would have been missing out on a lot of profit. And this is a simple example, but it gets much more extreme than this, and we'll walk through that here in a second, okay? So here's kind of just 3 reasons why you should not be evaluating performance solely by ROAS. Of course, keep it in mind, but it's not the key thing you should be looking at. So again, as we just explained, the LTV of the product is not included. And what I mean by LTV is not necessarily lifetime value, but just the value of the customer that you acquired over time that comes back to you for basically free, either through an email flow or through a post after they followed you, right? It does not account for lifetime value. And so again, you could have a very similar case like this that's much more extreme, where the difference is like a 1x return and a 5x, but this customer comes back 10 times more often. And so your differentiation there is huge. So ROAS does not include lifetime value or 60-day value or 90-day customer value. And so it's like you could literally be losing money on an ad and you won't cut it, and vice versa. So you have to measure the value of your customers that you acquire through ads over time, okay? The second thing is this just includes revenue. And that's kind of a problem, right? It doesn't include profit. So here's the thing. Different products have different COGS, and different products also have different lifetime values, which we'll get into in a second. But ROAS, again, doesn't include profit. And of course, you can do a blended profit model here where you just say across your entire product line, here's our margins, and in general, we should be getting a 3x ROAS, but in reality, different products have different costs. So when you get a purchase from ads, while it could be a 2x, it could be on a product that's twice as expensive as another product that you're advertising that's only at a 1x return. And again, you could be cutting that lower performing ad, even though the COGS on that lower performing product that you just sold on that lower performing ad are half as much as the ad that's doing twice as well, but with also twice the COGS. So again, it doesn't include profit. And so we have to understand also our profit on products, not just revenue. Okay, so this is also why we can't be solely making decisions off ROAS. And the third reason, which is probably the least talked about because it's kind of a hard thing to literally see, is that ROAS on some campaigns massively affects others. So for example, you could have a campaign that is a 1x return and another campaign, and this could be for any platform again, and another campaign that's like at a 5 to 6x. And the second you turn off that campaign that's at a 1x, over the course of 1 to 2 weeks, you will see that that 5 to 6x will go down to like a 3 to 4. And the only reason some ad sets perform or some campaigns perform well is because another campaign is feeding them. And sometimes it's hard to see because platforms are not transparent at all with what is interacting with what, and order overlap and display overlap. There's all these things happening. But again, you can't be cutting ads just based off ROAS. You have to say, if I cut this, will this affect other campaigns? And not only will it affect other campaigns on the platform you're working on, but it will also affect campaigns on other platforms. So you could cut a Facebook ad campaign here at a 1x return, and now on Google, for some reason, your branded search campaign drops down from a 3 to a 2. And you're like, oh, there must be something else going on. No, it's actually because Facebook was feeding Google. And this can happen across the board. TikTok can feed Facebook, which feeds Google. You have these strings and lines that go through every platform and every channel, even into email. And it's hard to see because, again, these platforms are not very visible and who's going where and like how much overlap there is. But again, just be very careful because you could be turning off the singular ad that is the only reason your other campaign is profitable. So it affects what you don't see, and you have to measure that and try to understand that, okay? And these are just 3 reasons. There's many more, but I hope just with that you can understand why we have to be looking at way more than just ROAS, because it's clearly missing out on quite a few variables, okay? Perfect. So in general, again, there is no one metric. There is no one metric, but there are 2 better ones than ROAS. And when it comes to e-commerce, when it comes to scaling, there is never any one metric you can look at. And it's the singular truth. You're always looking at 5 to 10 metrics in a layer and saying, okay, for each step of the funnel, you know, where are we at and how are these metrics performing versus what our KPI is. So you cannot only be looking at one thing. And most people only look at ROAS. The reason that is partly because of the marketing side. It's easy to understand, and it's kind of just been in the space for a long time. But in general, it's not a great indicator of success because it's missing out on way too many other things, okay? So here's 2 variables that you can kind of replace ROAS with or add in to give you a better idea of what ROAS is, okay? The first is FOV to new customer acquisition cost. So first order value and the relationship of your first order value of a customer relative to the cost that it took to acquire that first customer, okay? So we're actually going to run through that one first. So again, it's the relationship between the first order value of a new customer and the cost to acquire them. So this is very simple. It's just your first order revenue minus your cost of delivery, which includes, depending, shipping, if that's something that's included or not for you. You can also include like the packing, all that kind of stuff that goes into the cost from getting it from the warehouse into the customer's hand. And of course, the customer acquisition cost, we take that out as well over the customer acquisition cost, right? So super, super simple here. And all this is again, it's just looking at, hey, what is the value in revenue that we're generating of this new customer on their first order relative to the cost that it took to acquire this first customer. And that gives you a good idea relative to ROAS, on a more productized basis, how you're performing, right? So this just gives you a much deeper look, and it includes the cost of delivery and includes more costs. So it gives you a closer view to your net profit at the end of the day, unlike ROAS, which is just revenue. And it also just helps you understand it on a new customer level. And that's really important because most of the time ROAS is going to be focused on new customers, and this is solely focused on new customers. So it segments it from returning customers, which can often inflate how well you're actually doing because they're going to convert at a much higher percent, right, than old customers or than new customers, right? So, this is a good metric to look at there. Now let's go over what PLTV contribution margin is. Now I know this seems like a lot, but it's really quite simple. So all PLTV contribution margin is a measure of net profit over time without considering fixed costs on a pure SKU basis. So this is really going to be probably the best metric to look at instead of ROAS when it comes to learning how a particular ad is actually producing profit for you, right? So this not only includes, of course, your revenue on the product, but it also includes the COGS on the product, the fulfillment, and the acquisition cost that it took to sell that particular product, okay? So we're breaking it down on a per product basis, and of course, you can do a blend where you take all your products and you look at your LTV contribution margin across all your products, but the best is actually on a per product basis because different products have, of course, different COGS, they have different LTVs over different time periods, different customer values over different time periods, so it's better to look at it on a per product basis, okay? And really what the P is period. So it's the period in which, again, that we determine at the start. So whether you want to do a 60, 90 day, 180 day LTV look back, it's the period in which you decide is the most meaningful period for your business, and looking at that on that LTV contribution margin basis. So the gold standard is 60 days. I typically like to do 90 days. Some brands that we work with that are more in the luxury space will do 180 days. Brands that are more on the impulse buy side will do 60, 45, etc. Okay, so it just depends on the sales cycle and all those variables that we mentioned earlier. So how do we actually measure period LTV contribution margin, right? So all it is we pick our period, and then let's just say it's 60 days, and then we just take our 60-day product revenue, obviously the COGS over the 60 days for those products, the fulfillment, so that's packing, shipping, anything that it takes to get the product from the warehouse into the customer's hands that you pay for, and then of course the acquisition cost, which is AC. We subtract all those and we just put that over product revenue, and this will give us the relationship between how much revenue was generated versus the relationship between the costs and the fulfillment and all this over that particular time frame, right? So we're looking at product revenue that was generated, over 60 days or 90 days, right? It's not product revenue from a singular day. So what this can often look like is, you sell product, let's say you have $100 in product revenue, you have $20 in COGS, right? So we'd be at 80, then we have a few other costs with fulfillment and acquisition. Now maybe we're at 50. So then in the end, maybe we have 50 over 100 in product revenue. So we'd be at a 1/2 when it comes down to it, okay? So again, this is just a relationship between the revenue you generate over time, whether it's 60, 90 days, 180, whatever, relative to all the costs included in your revenue as well, okay? So period LTV contribution margin is by far the best metric to look at if you had to pick one, even though it makes no sense to pick one. But if you had to, this is definitely the one to look at because it includes the lifetime value element, the short-term lifetime value element. It includes the COGS, it includes the fulfillment, and it includes acquisition cost. The only thing we can't really include is fixed costs, right? But it gets you to as close to net profit as possible. It connects your advertising to your net profit in a way that revenue from the ROAS doesn't, because again, ROAS just simply does not include COGS or fulfillment or per product LTV on a time period, right? So that's very, very important. So I know you're like, hey, how do we actually calculate this? Well, you are going to have to use a tool like Triple Whale, and in Triple Whale, you'll just put in your product costs and it will just spit out for each product your different 60-day LTVs, et cetera, but it'll also give you like a 60-day LTV contribution margin and all that kind of thing. So you can just use a tool to calculate this. Statless also does this as well. There's a few others, but in general, this is one of the most important metrics, okay? So let's go ahead and move on to new seasonality, okay? So like everything, when it comes down to it, it moves in waves, right? So again, as we know, most brands are going to be doing most of their revenue, a third, a quarter, whatever it is, a lot of their revenue between the Black Friday and kind of winter holiday season, okay? And it moves in waves, and it's really important to understand how to ride these waves, but also how not to fry your customer base at the same time, and also how to take advantage of the natural sales cycles that occur within these, because this is really the only way to push through a lot of those barriers that happen when you're trying to scale a brand. You just come across these natural occurring cycles, okay? So let's go through this real quick, and I'm actually going to add in another page here to draw this out for you. So this is a really cool idea from Taylor Holiday, and he calls it himself the 4 peaks theory. I like to call it like the 6 peaks theory, and we'll go through it real quick here. So the concept is basically that throughout the year, you have different peaks and troughs of sale volume, and with that also has peaks and troughs of ad cost and customer conversion rate. And so typically, let's say this is Jan 1. I'll kind of try to scribble down on J1. Let's say this is like Jan 1 of 2023, and this is Jan 1 of 2024. Typically, we're going to be coming kind of off a hot streak, so you might kind of come off pretty high. You tank here, we go into Valentine's Day, and maybe there's a little bit of a hump there. Then you kind of have some spring season stuff. Then we get a little bit of a hump for Mother's Day. Summer is usually pretty dead, not a lot going unless you are particularly a summer niche brand. Then we go into Black Friday stuff here. And again, I made this graph a little too long. And then we go into, some of our December stuff here. And it depends on the brand. Sometimes your Black Friday might be higher than your winter sales, but either way, you have 2 big humps here and pretty much dies off, right? And we'll just say this is actually J1 of 2024 down here. Cool. So typically through the year, you're going to see most of your sales volume come obviously through Black Friday here. So we have one peak for kind of winter holidays. You have another peak for Black Friday. You might have a peak for Mother's Day / Father's Day, depending on the brand, and then maybe a Valentine's Day peak as well. So typically you're going to have around 4 peaks. Now the goal here is there's really 2 objectives. Number 1 is to maximize on the peaks and maximize on the troughs, okay? And so first of all, it's better to have a more stable brand so you can predict cash flow and predict inventory. So during these dead periods, you need to come up with creative ways to increase the amount of volume and visitors, right? That's one of the pieces to our equation, the amount of volume and visitors that you're getting to your site. So you should be adding a peak between kind of that Father's Day, Mother's Day, summer dead period. Again, if your brand is not a seasonal summer brand like a swimwear brand, so you need to add a peak here. And then ideally you want to add a peak somewhere between the Valentine's Day and like Mother's Day stuff. And again, your brand might not make any sense for Valentine's Day. So then you're going to want to add either a second peak here or a really big peak that just overtakes these 2, just meaning a bigger event during this kind of dead season. So here now, instead of around like the 4 peak range, we're more around the 6 to 7 peak range, right? Because we added these peaks during the dead period. So what does that mean, adding peaks? Well, really all we're doing is you need to find creative ways to market either to your old reoccurring audience or adding a lot more new people into your funnel, and ideally both. So some examples of this, and probably the most successful, is going to be Amazon Prime Day. While they didn't really need a peak because Prime Day is so close to holidays and Black Friday, it's still a branded event that became its entirely owned thing. And there's a lot of examples like this where brands do clear out sales during the summer, all sorts of things like that. So you can do a new product release, a limited edition product. You can do some sort of like clearance kind of promo, whatever makes sense for your brand, right? If you're a luxury brand, that's going to look mostly like a free gift or some sort of customization to the luxury product event, a special edition product drop during the dead period. You have to come up with a creative way that resonates with your target audience to add an additional peak here. And either between Valentine's Day and Mother's Day, or if you don't have a Valentine's Day type product or niche brand, then adding a second peak here as well. So you need to be adding, again, you can do so many different things: promos, product releases, limited edition drops, collaborations. There's limitless things you can do, but you just have to be very cognizant of this, because now instead of having this super choppy, like kind of wild year, you can even it a lot more out with your events and with some of your special things that you do throughout the year, and time it out again so you can predict inventory better, cash flow smoother, and ultimately a lot of the time you can create a huge boost in revenue just from getting creative on some of these events and kind of special product releases and whatnot. Cool. So that's part one of this. The second part is taking advantage of the peaks and troughs, right? So we all know ads get more expensive the more people that are bidding on them, the more people in the market, right? So during Black Friday, you will see the highest ad costs of the year, and ad costs correlate almost exactly to the sales peaks, right? Mother's Day, ads get more expensive. Valentine's Day, ads get more expensive. So if you are a big advertiser, of course, the question is always like, should we be spending on ads and trying to acquire new customers, or even retargeting old customers during these more aggressive times, right? So ideally, in an ideal world, because your CPMs, right, that metric we went over here, right? Your CPMs are going to be most expensive when everyone else is advertising, right? Because it's a stock market. The more demand, the higher the cost, the lower the supply, right? All that kind of thing. So during these periods here, your CPMs are going to be super high, exactly relative. And during these troughs, they're going to be pretty cheap. So it's going to be on paper a good time to acquire customers, right? Because your CPM, this variable here, that makes it more expensive to acquire customers and retarget old customers, this is going to be lower, right? So ideally, you're advertising the least during the peaks, which sounds counterintuitive. You're advertising the least during the peaks and actually advertising the most during the troughs, right? Because technically, on paper, your ad costs are the cheapest during these troughs. Everyone knows January, usually through early Feb, has some of the cheapest ad costs of the year because everyone thinks customers are fried from the holidays and Black Friday. In reality, you can still make a lot here simply because your CPMs are so cheap that it counters the lower conversion rate that you see from customers, right? So that's why when brands like shut off ads for the summer, it's like, it's bad. It's bad news because you're missing out on all these super cheap acquisition costs. Cool. So what does this mean for you, right? You still should be advertising during peak season. You still should keep ads on for Black Friday and all this stuff. You don't want to miss out on the increased demand and the higher conversion rates because people are buying and there's more demand. That's a higher CPM. You should not turn them off. But the lesson here is more that during these trough times, when you do have less consumer demand and when you do have lower conversion rates, that you should still be advertising and you should still maintain budgets during these troughs because your costs are going to be much lower to acquire customers, right? And during these peaks, when ad costs are expensive but demand is also higher, continue advertising, right? Feel free to scale budgets even if it's more expensive as long as it makes sense, but put more of an emphasis and focus on organic remarketing, email, SMS, social posts, social giveaways, influencer collabs, all that stuff. Focus more on the organic side during these periods because you will save money on those expensive customer acquisition retargeting costs. And in addition, you will be filling up your funnel during these trough times with new customers, right? So again, let's say you have a 60-day LTV. Let's say you determine for my brand, in 60 days, people usually buy a second time. So for example, if we were like a month or two away from like Black Friday, that month or two away, you should be going so incredibly crazy on customer acquisition because you know, in general, people are going to come back in 60 days anyway. That compounded with a Black Friday offer will go crazy for your brand. So these are the things we have to keep in mind in timing it, but also understanding that we should not be turning off ads simply because it's a slower conversion time. Being aware that our costs are a lot lower during especially January, during the summer dead season, if your brand, again, is not a niche brand. And just being cognizant that we should be focusing actually more on organic marketing during these peaks because costs are just so much more expensive in general, right? So just be aware of these things. It's different for every brand. And as long as your numbers and ROAS make sense, you can always spend more during peaks and spend less during these troughs. But just keep in mind how those costs change and how you should be implementing more events like this. Typically, the best situation is to be filling up your new customers during these troughs and then be retargeting them and selling them again, because they'll be way cheaper to sell the second time or free the second time or third time during these peaks, if that makes sense, right? So focus on organic marketing here, focus more on paid here. Again, still continue paid, still continue acquisition retargeting, but really push organic here, fill up the funnel during the troughs, and then kind of reap the crop in the peaks. Cool. Hope some of those ideas make sense there. Just want to kind of explain that fully because there's a few nuances within that. Okay. So let's go through just in general, kind of an overview of the 2023 landscape when it comes to a consumer spending level and all that good stuff. So I actually don't have too much here, so I'll be just pulling up the video. So in general, 2023 has been an interesting year, and we're continuing to see that going into holidays and Black Friday. Definitely, of course, lower consumer spending. Of course, inflation is eating at your COGS, making that a lot more expensive, eating at people's savings, making that also a lot more expensive for people to buy your products. So what we're seeing now, of course, is brands that are willing to work on offers and work on usually limited edition, urgency-based sales is working better than just your traditional kind of 20% off kind of thing. So in general, it's about getting creative, creating scarcity and urgency with your offers. We're seeing now that creative and copy is just more important than ever. All these ad platforms are going fully AI and going fully automated targeting. In the next couple of years, it will be pretty much fully automatic with no user input. So the only thing that you can decide and determine your success by is with, of course, your product, but most importantly, your offer, your creative, your video, your image, and your copy, right? Those are going to be the big variables this year, and that's what we're seeing. In addition, Meta is back, tracking is accurate. It's very close to what we're seeing on third-party attribution tools, so Meta is very much back. TikTok has been getting more and more expensive, so it was not as good as an opportunity as it was last year. If you missed out on the TikTok kind of heyday, that's okay. It's still solid. They've added in new features that make it better for acquiring customers that buy more expensive products. And we'll go over that later, but just keep that in mind. Google PMax Advantage Plus campaigns are really leading the charge. And in general, what we're seeing is that brands are pushing more into the content production field. So brands that are becoming production studios that are making viral content, that have creator teams and production teams, these are the brands that are not only growing the fastest across the board, but also who are generating a lot of the most lifetime value out of their customers. So that's really important. The more content you can produce, the more you can invest in content and having short form, long form, any kind of content out there and becoming a production studio, the faster you will grow. And that's just what we're seeing for pretty much every niche and every brand. Okay. So these are just some things for the 2023 landscape across the board that we're seeing. Just a couple ideas there. We're not going to get super detailed into the numbers, but overall, we have seen that every brand has been growing year over year, and everyone is doing quite well, at least the brands that we're looking at. But in general, we're seeing a little bit of that lipstick effect hit, which is just the idea that people buy smaller luxury goods during these times, and they're looking at cutting some of their spending on things like electronics and home goods and home decor, and they're more focused on little pleasures like little snacks and foods, services, little beauty, jewelry products, that kind of thing. That's what we're just seeing in general in terms of sales on retail and then also e-commerce. Okay, so just some things to keep in mind, but in general, we should still see a pretty strong holiday season coming up here in 2023. Sound good? Now, here are a few metrics that are kind of becoming more top of mind when it comes to evaluating how your brand's doing and determining what areas you need to improve upon to actually grow and get traction. Okay, and this is a little bit more advanced. I'll go over this quickly, but of course with iOS 14, the marketing efficiency ratio really came into play. That's more and more important this year, and it's getting more diluted into like new MER and old MER. So the efficiency of acquiring new customers and the efficiency of getting old customers back in, right? So that's just the difference between retargeting campaigns and top of funnel. And this can, again, be very hard to separate. So most brands just look at your overall marketing efficiency ratio, right? Your spend to revenue each month, just that ratio, but you can break it out on spend for new customers and then spend for old customers, old revenue versus new revenue. So definitely good to keep in mind, and you can identify whether you need to be doing a better job of acquiring new customers or whether there's improvement to actually optimize acquiring old customers better. And that's something that a lot of brands miss out on, but often is not talked about because most brands just aren't at the stage where that's even a thing because they're still worried about just getting people in the door. Okay. Next is like 90-day LTV contribution margin. And this, again, is really PLTV, what I mentioned before. So the period in which you deem as a good LTV measure. Again, the standard is 60 days, but I think that very much depends on the brand. So we went through this earlier. I won't go through it again. Again, CAC over LTV, similar to that other equation we went over earlier, but just customer acquisition to LTV and putting that same time period that you have on your contribution margin on that. So again, typically for me, it's going to be 90 days. The gold standard in the space is 60, but I like 90 for most brands more. So again, just looking at what is that acquisition cost to the value that that customer produces us in the next 90 days. And then in general, what we went through as well before with the conversion rate per SKU, your general conversion rate, and then conversion rate on new versus returning customers. These are just all good things to keep in mind. And then AOV in general, again, AOV for per SKU basis. So for each product, what is the average order value when that product is included in the cart and in the bag when they check out, like what products are bundled with it, and then that AOV for new customers and returning customers. So these are just some metrics. I'm not going to go deep into how you use and analyze these, but just some things to keep in mind. We'll go through it more later when it comes to like what's new and what people are actually looking at for 2023. All right. So just a couple of different ideas in this. I wanted to provide a broad overview of some of the most important levers. Again, we can't get into every minute detail in this because it'd be way too long, but I hope this was useful for you. And I hope you can start to implement some of these metrics and evaluating your performance and looking at things from a much higher level. Start implementing some of those seasonality concepts and strategies. Again, we can get into more details on exactly how you do that later. And in general, like I said, just keep in mind that things are going from a much more micro level to a much more macro level this year. And we're looking at the marketing funnel as a whole. Again, we do analyze each metric for each piece of the funnel and for each platform and for each SKU, of course, but it's very important to keep in mind just the overall net profitability, which is more what we're evaluating success now by versus like ROAS like in like 2012, 2013. Okay. So the next video, we'll get into some more details on the platform side of things. Otherwise, I hope this was useful. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you in the next module. All right, bye-bye.